So today I'll be talking about how the transatlantic slave trade affected Africans and affected the whole of the African continent itself. African history, like I always say, is very beautiful and rich. And I'm surprised that not too many people are concerned with African history, but I'm taking it upon myself to see that we can talk about African history in the simplest way. I won't take your time. I'll be very, very brief, and I'll give you exactly what some of the effects, or almost all the effects on Africa. Now, already for those who do not know, slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is also known as the triangular slave trade. Why is it called the triangular slave trade? It's because it involved three territories or three regions. One, Africa; secondly, Europe; and then the third were the colonies of Europe, among which were the Caribbean areas and the American areas, of which slaves were being taken to. Now, how did it come to play? First of all, the Europeans were known to bring things like firearms, guns, gunpowders, and then mirrors and some enticing products that were alluring and enticing to African and the African chiefs that were in charge of the slaves. And so they gave these things in exchange for slaves from Africans. So it simply meant now that Europe brought firearms and guns that enabled slavery and then gave it to Africans. The Africans went into the interior, got the slaves by raiding, kidnapping, killing, and then brought the slaves back to the Atlantic shore, and then handed them over to the Europeans, who now shipped these slaves down to the Caribbean. So that is what makes it a triangular trade, from Europe to Africa, from Africa back to the Caribbeans and the Americas, and from the Caribbeans, the products of which were oftentimes being cultivated in these plantations were now taken to Europe and other territories where they were needed. So it is the triangular trade. So that's that. So now, what are the effects of this slave trade? Knowing, first of all, you need to know that the slave trade involved the movement of a large number of very many Africans outside or out of Africa down to Europe. So it means that, first of all, one of the effects of the slave trade is depopulation. The slave trade led to the removal or the movement of a very large number of able bodies out of Africa down to the Caribbeans, of which they were used for manual labor, and then they cultivated a whole lot in the plantations that were now shipped back to Europe for European consumption and use. So that is one of the effects that the slave trade had on Africa. Another effect of the slave trade on Africa is death, high death rate. How? Okay, now I explained that the Europeans often came with guns, gunpowders, and firearms. So when they brought these guns and gunpowders here to Africa and handed them over in exchange for slaves, the African chiefs often took these weapons and used them to get more slaves, because getting more slaves enriched them. And so oftentimes when they went into the interior, they often got these slaves by killing, raiding, and kidnapping. And so as a result now, another effect of the slave trade is mass death and mass killing and raiding in the African continent, because to get or to procure these slaves, they had to use different inhumane means to get the slaves. In some areas, slaves were known to be some people who were criminals, and so in some areas, some people were even falsely accused of being criminals, just so they can make up the large number or make up the numbers for slaves. Slavery was not really a very human an act, but then it took place, and here we are. And so it led to a very large number of killings and deaths of Africans themselves in the interior, and very annoying to say, of Africans by very many Africans. So that is another point. Another point again is social instability. It's very related to death. And so when you look at how these slaves were being gotten, it tells you that very many cities were raided, and many communities were subject to constant raiding and kidnappings, constant attacks from the slave raiders who needed slaves, of which they wanted to transport or hand over to the Europeans that needed them for manual labor. And so political instability and social instability was the norm during the slave trade era, and it really affected Africa very well. Another point again to bring is brain drain. Considering the fact that very many Africans were shipped out of Africa, it should serve to tell you that very many enlightened Africans were taken out of Africa in large number. Looking at the fact that over 12 million slaves were shipped out of Africa, that serves to tell you that very many enlightened and bright minds were taken out of Africa, of whom not all returned. Very many chose to remain back there in the Caribbean and the Americas, people of which we refer to as the Africans in diaspora. And so the slave trade led to a brain drain from Africa. Another point that slave trade contributed to is an economic stagnation. Why did I say economic stagnation? Looking at the fact that during the slave trade era, very many communities were raided, it meant that economic activities was stopped or probably was very, very much reduced during that period in time, as many people either feared for their lives or maybe joined the slave raiders rather than indulging in economic activities. Agriculture was not on the rise, and it experienced a very large decline during the slave trade era because more the economic activity that seemed more lucrative at that period in time was the slavery rather than agriculture or other local trade. Another point again is that slave trade also disrupted trade networks among very many African communities. It also brought about ethnic conflicts, because looking at the fact that communities raided communities in search of slaves, it meant that very many communities lived in isolation and in suspicion of one another as to not be victims of slave raiders. And so there is also one last point that I want to give on the effect of slavery or the slave trade on Africa. And this point now, I just want to give a brief analysis. Looking at the slave trade, that it happened from 14th century to 19th century, we should ask ourselves how it also affected Africa, looking comparatively side by side with Europe. Now, when you look at around that period in time when slave trade began, you realize that Europeans were experiencing what they call the age of discovery. It was the period where they began to embark on very many voyages and escapades and adventures, of which people like the Portuguese, who were one of the first people to navigate the Atlantic Ocean, began to take on these undertakings. And so during that period in time, Europe were growing. They experienced the age of discovery, then the age of reason, the Renaissance, the age of enlightenment, and even scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. Now, looking at that period in time, you will see that while Europe was growing, Africa was receding. Africans were declining and moving backwards in terms of economics and politics and every other phase of life. And so by the end of slave trade, most European countries that began to attain industrialization, like I said in one of, I think I treated one of that topic on why slavery was abolished. And so countries like Britain, which was the first to industrialize around 1750, 1760, and other countries that followed now had already attained industrialization towards the period of the abolition of slavery. So by the end of slave trade, Africans found themselves worse than how they were before slavery commenced, while Europe found themselves having advanced beyond where they were when slavery began. And so that is actually one of a very vital point to note as to how slavery really affected Africa. African history is a very important topic. I wish that Africans can always and also put interest in African history. I always say African history is rich and beautiful, and so I'm breaking it down so that you can love and enjoy it. I hope you did learn one or two things from this. I'll be treating another topic next time, and see you next time.